Yeah, I'll react to that, sure. Alright, Wild Man. I will do this. How Ukraine liberated Kherson. The 2022 Southern Counteroffensive. Preemptive-like. So I've been watching a lot of videos on Kings and Generals about the Russia-Ukraine war, and I need to get back into them. I know there are a few videos for me to catch up on, but War Graphics, also a great channel. And let's go. Sure. My name's Connor, guys. I like to learn, hit all the buttons, the good ones, and let's go. Let's learn.
Occupation. Today, we're going to look at how the Russian military's occupation of Kherson, Ukraine, was really put to the test. Could Ukraine repel the invaders, or would Russia be able to keep a firm hold on the city? In August 2022, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky announced the official beginning of a counteroffensive that would shock the world. A counteroffensive that would eventually lead to the liberation of Kherson and trouble for Putin's war. So today, let's follow along with the stunning success of Ukraine's southern front and explore just how they achieved that truly incredible feat.
Okay.
If they want to survive, it's time for the Russian military to flee. These were the words of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in August 2022 as he announced the official beginning of a counteroffensive in southern Ukraine, an advance that would, in just a few short months, shock the world as it pummeled through the Russian lines, eventually leading to the liberation of Kherson, the first major city occupied by Russia at the very onset of the war. When the invasion began on February the 24th, 2022, Russia advanced into Ukraine from nearly every side. But contrary to what the entire world expected would happen, the Ukrainian army forces repelled the majority of these attacks, keeping the Russians out of their capital, Kyiv, holding down the eastern city of Kharkiv, and defending the port city of Odessa. There was, however, one place where the Russians saw some early victories. On the opening day of the invasion, armored divisions poured out of Crimea, crossing into Kherson Oblast. The Kherson Oblast is flat and marshy, offering little to no natural defenses other than its rivers. It was for this reason that the area had been littered with minefields to deter a quick Russian advance, but the Russians sped right through them without taking any losses. It later turned out that a member of Ukraine's SBU intelligence agency had given Russia maps of the minefields ahead of time, as well as key locations of ammunition depots and troop routes, which explains that rapid advance forward. Just a day later, the Russians had already advanced to the Dnieper River, and a fierce battle began for control of the Antonovsky Bridge, a battle which left dozens dead on both sides, and the bridge cluttered with the burning wreckage of destroyed tanks. The bridge changed hands a few times over the next day or two before the Russians firmly took control of it, along with other river crossing points. Once the river crossings had fallen, the Ukrainians retreated to Kherson, where they were able to fend off the Russian advance with airstrikes for a few more days. Eventually, however, they were forced to retreat as Russian ground forces entered the city. At the beginning of March, all that stood between the Russians and Kherson was a group of city volunteers, lightly armed with a few rifles and some Molotov cocktails. By the next day, the city was entirely occupied. Over the course of the next several weeks, Russia installed a new mayor in the city, former KGB agent Alexander Kabats, and the Russian flag was raised on nearly every street. Kherson was a key strategic victory for Russia for several reasons. First of all, it was the only regional capital to be fully captured since the invasion began, giving the military some tangible success to broadcast back home. Second, the Kherson Oblast gave Russia access to massive grain supplies, which it began exporting as soon as it was harvested. And third, it was a foothold for further advances, which could either be along the coast to Odessa, which the Russians desperately wanted for its valuable ports, or deeper inland towards Kryvyi Rih, which houses some of the largest metallurgical and mining facilities in the whole of Ukraine. Kherson's occupation also allowed for a land corridor along the southern countryside, linking up with the occupied territories in the east. But the time for advancing deeper into Ukraine wouldn't come quite yet. The next city inland, Mykolaiv, withstood every advance that was thrown at it, leaving the Russians with only some of it to blast and preventing them from moving any further, keeping the front line somewhat stable for the next few months. Resistance to the occupation was widespread, despite the harsh punishments dished out for it. Any protests during occupation are handled with violence, such as on March the 13th, when thousands of citizens marched into the city centre and were met with gunfire, with tear gas, rubber bullets, and flashbangs. Videos surfaced of people holding Ukrainian flags and jumping onto Russian vehicles, and medical workers quitting their jobs en masse. On top of this, more serious partisan resistance was also brewing, carrying out assassinations and bombings that killed 2 Russian generals and several pro-Russian officials or bloggers. The most high-profile of these was the assassination of Vitaly Gura, who had been appointed deputy head of the nearby city Nova Kakhovka, though it was later revealed that his death had been faked by the FSB. All the while, the humanitarian situation in Kherson was deteriorating, with reports of low food, a complete lack of medicine, and a shortage of clean drinking water, not to mention the thousands of Ukrainians forcefully being deported. Though, of course, you wouldn't have the faintest idea of any of this if you only watched television back in Russia. State channels showed videos of citizens welcoming the Russian army and food and water being handed out to the city's population. Now, despite the occupiers' constant promise and even billboards displaying the motto, "Russia is here forever," all of it was about to change, and by midsummer, Ukrainian officials were already warning their citizens to evacuate. The battle was returning to Kherson. In early summer, Ukrainian officials stated that if they were given sufficient weaponry, they'd be able to launch a devastating counterattack. And sure enough, those weapons came, most notably in the form of the M142 High Mobility Artillery Rocket System, or HIMARS. After the first of these began arriving in late June, they were already being used with devastating effect. Their first attack took down an estimated 40 Russian soldiers. These rocket systems have incredibly high range and high accuracy, allowing Ukraine to strike distant targets with absolute precision. One of the first uses of them on the southern front was a strike on the Antonovsky Bridge that they'd lost control of months earlier. This left the bridge intact, but
I mean, I hear HIMARS, mentioned in like every video I've seen on the conflict. So obviously they're a very big deal.
Antonovsky Bridge that they'd lost control of months earlier. This left the bridge intact, but it rendered its road just too damaged for any vehicle to make it across. HIMARS have done a considerable amount of damage, not only to Russia's equipment, but also to their finances. This is because Ukraine has built dozens of fake wooden HIMARS at which Russia continues to fire their most expensive missiles, unaware that they're spending millions of dollars to blow up some cheap plywood.
Right. So are these the same things? Like, I've seen videos of like Russian missile launchers. They look a bit like this, but they seem like they have a lot more missiles, like at cartridges. Like they can go and go like 20 out. So that's more of a so they're using, they have less accuracy, so they just rely on shooting more missiles, whereas this missile launcher has less missiles, but more accuracy.
This deception has been so convincing that at one point Russian officials were claiming to have destroyed more HIMARS than the US government had even sent to Ukraine. HIMARS and various drone strikes were the main weapons that Ukraine used to strike far behind enemy lines in preparation for the southern counteroffensive, striking ammunition depots and military bases across the south, along with saboteurs behind enemy lines being responsible for more than a few explosions. One HIMARS strike even reportedly killed a Russian major general and 12 of his officers. Throughout July, the Ukrainian officials were warning their citizens in the south to flee or to seek cover, promising that a massive counter-strike was on its way. There were announcements of major troop buildups, massive operations being planned, and there were promises of the liberation of Kherson. All this fanfare certainly caught the attention of Russian officials, who relocated thousands of troops and vehicles southward in anticipation of the attack. Now you might be wondering, why on earth was the Ukrainian government publicizing their upcoming attack so much? And, well, that's because it was, of course, all a trap that the Russians walked into. I mean, hindsight's 2020, but really, guys? You see, with so much of their manpower and equipment rotating to the south, the annexed regions in eastern Ukraine were now guarded not only with less men, but also less experienced and poorly equipped men, which would allow the Ukrainian counteroffensive in the east raced to run through the Russian lines like a hot knife through butter. The other part of the trap was to lure Russian forces across the Dnieper River and then trap them there after destroying the bridges that could take them home. Back in the south...
I know rivers are a big deal for any, barrier defense for any, whatever river it might be in a military scenario, but the Dnieper, this river right here seems very much an obstacle in most of its length. I mean, it seems to narrow at some parts, but it looks to be almost lake-like in a lot of places.
The Russians launched a major offensive of their own, capturing a few villages, but really not much else, instead opting to spend most of their efforts bombing the cities of Mykolaiv, Kryvyi Rih, and Dnipro. By mid-August, the two forces were clashing in the northwest corner of Kherson Oblast, fighting mostly to a standstill, with both sides claiming that they'd repelled an attack. Finally, on August the 29th, Zelensky...
I gotta pee quick, guys. Be right back. I can't make it. Okay, sorry, I'm back. I washed my hands.
Announced the official sides claiming that they'd repelled an attack. Finally, on August the 29th, Zelensky announced the official beginning of the counteroffensive. And despite the recent Russian buildup, the armed forces of Ukraine began marching south. The first breakthrough came from the operational group Kakova, who smashed through lines defended by Russian paratroopers and a Donetsk conscript unit. There was a massive increase in Ukrainian artillery and rocket attacks all along the front line, the result of which led to a Russian military base being destroyed. Ukrainian attack planes were used to provide air support for the ground forces, but only with caution, as the sky is still hotly contested. Bridges were bombed, one after another, trapping thousands of Russians on the wrong side of the river and cutting them off from support, and partisans also began openly firing against their occupiers, with gunfire reported in the center of Kherson. After just a couple of days, the Russians' entire first line of defense was broken, and the second one was now the focus of the fighting. Here,
before I forget, guys, you know how the whole thing, like countries sending tanks to the Ukraine, and now Putin saying that that's like, oh, well, now it's fair game for us to attack NATO countries. Why is it the tanks that's making him say that? I know he says a bunch of random stuff that probably isn't true, but why is it that the HIMARS didn't make him say that, but the tanks do? Is that because a tank is seen as like a offensive military vehicle or weapon, or is he just being a lunatic?
Reportedly, both sides experienced heavy casualties as a few villages were retaken, and both sides made small advances at many points on the front line. It's also at this point that Zelensky's advisor, Arestovic, made it clear that the southern counteroffensive was going to be a slow and grinding one, not a lightning war. However, judging by how the offensive was about to take off, well, perhaps this was just another bit of misinformation. Either that, or the Russians simply got their asses handed to them much quicker than everybody expected. Wouldn't be the first time. In early September, Ukraine spearheaded three main points of attack into the Kherson Oblast, and they were making steady progress with each day. According to the British Ministry of Defense, much of their success was the result of exploiting Russia's terrible logistics and command structure, which they took advantage of by disrupting communication lines and destroying pontoon bridges. The chaos in Russian command was made even worse when Ukraine began its eastern counteroffensive, putting Russian generals in a panic, trying to decide how to defend two fronts at once. By the 13th of September, just 2 weeks after the official announcement of the offensive, Ukraine had retaken an estimated 6,000 square kilometers, and with every passing day, they were creeping closer and closer to Kherson, where thousands of Russians awaited their advance. At this point, simply forbidden to retreat. Following these quick losses, the Russian government played some of the trick cards left up their sleeve. First of all, they began another series of bombings targeting civilian infrastructure in the region, most notably bombing a dam in Kryvyi Rih, flooding hundreds of homes, and striking a bus station in Dnipro, perhaps hoping to scare Ukraine into stalling their advance. But perhaps their most desperate move was announcing the official annexation of Kherson Oblast into the Russian Federation. The sham referendums and official annexation of the Kherson, Zaporizhzhia, Luhansk, and Donetsk regions had originally been planned for the end of 2022, but in light of the new developments on the battlefield, these were rushed up a few months. The ballot, written in both Ukrainian and Russian, read, "Do you approve of having Kherson Oblast exit Ukraine, reforming Kherson Oblast into a self-governing state as well as incorporating it into the Russian Federation with subject rights of the Russian Federation?"
How does that make any sense? Do you approve of having Kherson Oblast exit Ukraine, reforming Kherson Oblast into a self-governing state, as well as incorporating into the Russian Federation, subject to the rights of the Russian Federation. So, is it self-governing, really? And who are they trying to fool here? Like, who does Russia think that these elections are going to be like, oh, wow, now I guess he was right. Look at it, you know? Case closed. Everyone leave, I guess. I mean, who...
According to the Russian Central Election Commission, so entirely unbiased right there, 87% of voters supported the annexation, to the surprise of nobody. Those 13%...
I bet you it was 100% because you had to, and then they just made it like, let's make it like 87 to show that it was fair, you know?
7% of voters supported the annexation, to the surprise of nobody. Those 13% better be afraid. Now, of course, there is no one else to corroborate this claim, as Russia outright refused to let any recognized international parties be present, so the whole thing is about as legitimate as Lukashenko's recent elections in Belarus, so, not very. Perhaps the Kremlin hoped that once the territories were officially Russian soil, Ukraine would think twice about setting foot in it, but this couldn't have been further from the truth. Just a few days after the annexation, Ukrainian forces had captured another dozen or so villages in the region north of Kherson, forcing the Russians to withdraw from some positions and retreat south to avoid being encircled. October saw a rare acknowledgement of Russian casualties when Ramzan Kadyrov announced that a Ukrainian artillery strike had killed 23 of his men and wounded a further 58. This came as Ukrainian forces were coming well within range to strike targets in Kherson on a daily basis. By the beginning of November, the momentum was unstoppable. Ukrainian forces were reported to have retaken 41 settlements in the area in just a month. Around 40,000 Russian troops remained in Kherson, but given how the previous engagements had gone, and not wanting to lose more men in another trap, Russia announced the withdrawal of its forces from Kherson, and by the thousands they began retreating across the Dnieper River. The dominoes now were falling one after another. Soon the village Snirivka was taken, followed quickly by Kyselovka, putting the Ukrainian armed forces less than 10 kilometers or just 6 miles from Kherson. On November the 11th, Ukrainian troops entered Kherson, met with crowds waving their blue and yellow flags. Russia is here forever turned out to be about 8 months. Ukrainian forces briefly pushed beyond Kherson, with some fighting happening on the far side of the Dnieper River, but this largely stagnated and there hasn't been a ton of progress since. Kherson had been retaken, though as of this video being written in mid-January 20...
Am I still in view? Yeah, I'm fine. Sorry, just checking.
2023, much of the... Though, as of this video being written in mid-January 2023, much of the Kherson Oblast south of the city is still occupied. The liberation of Kherson was one of Ukraine's greatest successes since the beginning of the war. The Ukrainian military had shown that they were not only capable of defending their territory, but that they were more than capable of taking it back. Morale skyrocketed across the entire nation, and world leaders were pleased to see tangible results of the support that was being sent to Ukraine. Of course, though, all this success had come with a heavy price tag. Drawing much of Russia's forces to the south ahead of the offensive meant that there was serious resistance across the entire front line, and so of the 35,000 or so Ukrainians involved in the operation, around 9,500 were killed or wounded. Jesus. It's really impossible to know Russia's stats, as you all know they're not exactly keen with sharing them with the rest of the world.
No, they're reliable. What do you mean? Why? What?
As you all know, they're not exactly keen with sharing them with the rest of the world, but Ukraine estimated 2,500 Russians killed and 5,000 wounded, which, if correct, means that Ukraine took more losses. But the real damage suffered by Russia, it wasn't in terms of manpower, but in image. Not just because they lost a key city whose occupation was so heavily publicized as a victory, but because their bluff had been called. All the talk of all means necessary to defend Russia's territory, just to let a new piece slip out of their hands so quickly, showing that, as many predicted, the annexed territories will not be held in the same regard as the rest of Russia. It sets a precedent for Ukraine to continue on to further campaigns, pushing the borders back, perhaps not just to where they were in 2014, but to where they were In 1991, liberating Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhzhia, and even Crimea are no longer just a fantasy, but even a real possibility.
What I don't get, guys, great video,
91.
as always, war graphics, geographics, biographics. Any channel where this guy is the narrator is a good channel, in my opinion. Oh my god, I had a big question. Thanks, guys, for watching, by the way. Love y'all. I'll see you guys next time, but hold on. Oh, no.
They continue to be held in the same bluff territory. Was so an image.
No. I had a question.
Not just because suffered 1,000 weeks sharing them with the rest of the world, but in image.
Oh, I remember. So the thing with Putin, even though he obviously lies a lot to bluff and, you know, puff out his chest, but I mean, I don't think it's like, it's not the same as Kim Jong. Who's the one in power? Kim Jong-un? Kim Jong-il? Kim Jong-un? The one that's in power. Like, when he says it and threatens, I'm like, yeah, I don't think that... I think you know that any damage you cause with your nuclear weapons will be minuscule to you getting just destroyed as a country. And I think he knows that. And the fact that I actually believe that Russia is capable of firing many nukes with a certain degree of accuracy and professionalism, despite all the unprofessionalism we've seen them in military actions in Ukraine. But it's like, yeah, he's a crazy guy who keeps threatening nukes like Kim Jong-un, whatever the one is. But I'm actually kind of scared of Russian nuclear weapons and how much they could just set off if they're like, all right, we're backed into a corner. What's the, like, we're already so down in the dumps. Where else is there to go but up? And I'm just afraid of that possibility. But I don't think it's going to happen. But it's like, yeah, I don't trust what Putin says. But at the same time, they have a lot of nuclear weapons with a past, albeit mostly in the Soviet Union, of testing those weapons. So, very interesting video. Hope you guys are all doing well. And I'd like to see your comments, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye, guys.